Good morning, brothers and sisters and Yeshua the Messiah. This morning, I'm going to give a little brief testimony. I've done it a few times, and I didn't share it. It didn't come out quite right, whatever. I'm not trying to impress anybody, but I'm going to just go ahead and give a free ramble testimony, just to let you know who I am, what I've been through, and how I got where I am. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with first that if you're like someone who hates Christianity or Jewish people or any kind of belief in God, this is probably going to be really boring to you. And if you're someone who is not really interested in other people and their salvation stories, this will really be boring for you. So let me go ahead and just start. So I was raised. Well, let's see. My parents, they divorced when I was about 3 years old. We were from the south suburbs of Chicago, from the south side of Chicago, all over the city and Cook County. They divorced when I was about 3. My father remarried to the next year to a woman who he stayed married to even till now. She's just like a mother to me. And they are living in the city, and they're still married. I saw them as like a true love story. My mother she married a second time to a man when I was about 5, and she stayed married to him. I want to say till they divorced when I was about 12 or 13, and he was abusive physically to me, and he's abusive in a lot of ways. And my mother fell into alcoholism, so I was raised in a home with no religion. It was a lot of alcoholism, and there was abuse of many kinds. And then I would see my dad, every Shabbat day, every Saturday. He would come and pick us up, me and my brother, and we would go out to eat, go out to a movie, go to the arcade. In the 1980s, and for anyone who's a little older, in their 40s like me, the arcades were really cool back then. And if you're in the Chicago area, go to Galloping Ghost Arcade in Bolingbrook. That's a awesome place, but it's another thing. But I lived there. We didn't go to church, didn't talk about God. Although I have to say though, times when I did talk to my mom about God, she did say Jesus Christ on the cross. That's what she said. Died for your sins. And I remember even one night when I was talking about death, I have a great memory. But when I was a little boy, like 6 or 7 years old, I remember asking her about death, and she told me about the book of life. And then when I was, I want to say 3 or 4, I did pray with an uncle. I remember, I think I was 3 or 4 years old, and I could still distinctly remember praying to Jesus. My uncle, he lives in Indiana. He's a very faithful man. And I ask you to pray for him too, because he has some health concerns. So I ended up, fast forward to, let's say, my mid-20s, early 20s. I was just totally lost. I was experimenting in a lot of different ways, a lot of different things. And then I met Jane. I met my wife, who is my wife now, who is a Jewish woman. She was not a believer really, but she did go to temple on like certain holidays. But she was like a little bit like me, but just a little tiny bit more of a foundation. She did have a bat mitzvah. We listen to that sometimes. Or she's saying in the Hebrew, and you listen to everybody there is just kind of going through the motions, but she sounds so faithful. Maybe I'm biased because I love her so much. But so one day we lived together. We started dating, and we moved in together. We weren't faithful to God. We weren't. We were just like agnostic people living the culture and the world. And so we moved in together in the north side of Chicago in a little apartment, and we lived there for a while. I was working as a doorman, and she had different jobs, but she taught 1 year at Chicago public schools. She did some tutoring. She did like this mad science thing where she did like science projects in schools, which was really cool. One day she went out with a friend of hers that was Christian, and somehow, some way, she ended up buying a very cheap King James Bible, the one with the red cover, and there's no study guides, nothing. And one day I was smoking cigarettes, I was high, I was drinking coffee. I was playing a Grand Theft Auto 3 or 4 on the PlayStation 3, a multiplayer, killing people, and not a care in the world about God, for sure. I was not thinking of anything like that. I was very much, I think I was a decent guy, but I was totally following my own appetites, and my flesh. Looking back, when you come to faith as an atheist, you look back and it's mind-blowing, So one day she comes around me and she drops this Bible on my lap. And we argue about this, but I remember her saying, I don't want this. I don't need it. And so I took this Bible, and without even thinking, I'm playing my game, I got a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I opened my book bag, which I brought a book bag with all kinds of stuff to my job, and I threw it in the book bag. And I kept playing. Well, that night, I went to work, and I worked overnight, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., sitting in this lobby. Basically, we'd answer the phones, and hail cabs, and open doors for people that were coming in. It was fairly busy. And in the morning, we would deliver the newspapers and, leave. But one night I was sitting there alone, and it was probably about 3 in the morning, and I could hear the wind howling and the windows behind me, and I just felt something. And forgive me if I get emotional. I really don't care what anybody thinks. I left. What I left behind means it's worthless compared to knowing Him. But I felt something, and you have to understand, I was very mocking of people who believed. Let me just drop a seed. Someone who put a seed, who I thought of when I read this. But there was a close family friend. I won't say who it is or any relation or anything, but it was somebody close to us. They called me one day, about a couple years, a year or two before this, and their son was in a mental facility, like where they send a lot of different people to these places, going through things. It's not like they're not ruined forever, but he was having an eating disorder. He wasn't eating. They called me and they said, look, I want you to call him and encourage him. And I thought I was cool. I was cool. I was really proud of myself. I was full of myself. I didn't care a lot about other people. So I called him, very proud, thinking he's going to really appreciate a call from me, As soon as he got on the phone, I could feel something. I didn't know it then, but it was the Holy Spirit. It was the Ruach HaKodesh. He was full of it. And he started right off telling me about all these people he was telling about Yeshua, about Jesus, and all these people that were being saved and he was ministering to, and these things that he was talking about when he was there, and talking to me about it. And I was like speechless. I couldn't say a word. And then eventually he prayed for me. And we got off the phone and I realized I'm not so strong as I thought. And that was the seed that was planted that got me thinking. And so that night at the building where I worked, I just felt something, and I looked in my bag, and it was like a movie, like a mile away, like a mile down away. Like I could see this book, and I closed it and I laughed. I was like, I am not going to sit here and read the Bible. And I started reading it, and I read it slowly. I digested it. And so I'm reading through Genesis, and I'm starting to understand that what I had been mocking was shouldn't be mocked. That even if I didn't believe in Jesus, there was something here. About half the building where I worked was Jewish, and where these people did reject Christianity and Jesus, they were people of justice. These were people who they stood up for people, and I respected them a lot. So I started reading through this, and then over the course of a few weeks, I'm reading through. Maybe it was a week. I'm reading through, and I get to Leviticus, and I kind of slow down, And then I believed I was agnostic. I started to believe in God. There was a God. There was a higher power. There's something. And I believe it's probably the God of the Jews, God of Israel. And so I moved up. I said, I need to go to Yeshua. I need to go to Jesus. I need to learn the foundation of this faith. What is this really about? I always heard about Jesus and the cross. So I went to Matthew. And I started reading in Matthew. And I was blown away by what I was reading. And mostly what I figured out from reading this was that I'm not good. When you're proud, that's the hardest thing to admit, is that you're not good deep down, and that I'm not strong, and that there was something missing. Something missing from my life, and it was Yeshua. So I read up to chapter 5, and I felt something. Faith. I remember reading about Yeshua in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn." And I was like, I don't mourn. Blessed are the meek. That's not me. I'm not. For they'll inherit the land. I was like, I'm not going to inherit anything. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. I wasn't hungering for anything except having a fun night. I wasn't thinking very far. I didn't care about righteousness. Blessed are those who show mercy. I only showed mercy on those who I wanted to, like an idolatrous person. How blessed are those who are pure in heart. I knew then I'm not pure in heart. Blessed are those who make peace. I could care less about peace. Blessed are those who are persecuted because they pursue righteousness. And I knew then that I was someone who was not pursuing righteousness. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, tell vicious lies because you follow me. Rejoice and be glad. That just sounded crazy to me. So I'm reading, and I go through, and I go through Mark, and I see all the, that's like fast paced, and it's about the work he's doing. And then I got to the Gospel of John, and I was so struck by the love that he had for these people who are constantly messing up. Like 2 seconds later, they'd be behind him, like, who's the best one? Who's going to be the first in the kingdom? And he was constantly like, guys, like, what's wrong with you? And I knew when I got to the crucifixion that I had always heard all these stories of people, saying, and they're either in their testimonies or just trying to talk to me, like, yeah, I would be one of the disciples. I would be one of the Talmudim. I would be following him and waiting for him and watching. Not one who denied him or fled from him. And I knew that I was one of those who would have fled from him, who would have gambled and made fun of him. Yeah, for someone like me, the life I was living, it's a miracle. Faith is a gift. I read through the Gospel of John, and I was moved. I was sitting in this lobby. It was like a $250,000, $500,000 lobby of marble floors. It was just lights everywhere, chandeliers. And I was just weeping sometimes, reading these words. And I came to believe. I believe this has to be true. And then not long after that, Jane started reading too. She was so interested. And we went to Garfield Park Conservatory in the city. We were one day as like a little date, and we went out and we were looking at the flowers and the plants and just breathing in that nice smell. And I'll never forget this day. I was talking about it. I was talking about God. Now, I was not a person who talked about these things. So for her to see and hear me talk about this, to see the Spirit take hold, that was more gentle, it was more sincere, thoughtful. It was shocking to her. It was a radical change in my heart. Not in the outside, but I mean, in some ways, how I lived, how I talked. So there was an inside and outward change that was affected by the inside change. And so finally she says, this is not a Jewish book. The New Testament is not Jewish. And so I started to, I didn't even know either before I was reading that year. So I started telling her about it. And telling her about Yeshua was Jesus, that he said, I am here for the lost sheep of Israel. I told her the story about the Samaritan woman, the Gentile woman, and the scraps from the table. And I was telling her about these things. I was telling her everything took place in Israel. Everything. Everybody involved in this is Jewish. This is the Jewish Messiah. There's nothing more Jewish than believing in him. She was blown away, stopped in her tracks. And she asked me, you believe in miracles? And it was like I couldn't even believe the words coming out of my own mouth. I was like, yes, I do. I believe. So she was reading and I was reading. Things were changing. And one day, we sat down. It was February 15th, 2010. We held hands and we prayed. We prayed just like a lot of Christian churches today instruct us to, like the sinner's prayer, and we prayed even more. We prayed our hearts out. And we said, from this day, we want to be followers of Jesus, Yeshua. And we don't want to turn back for the rest of our lives. And from there, we found the closest local church that we could, and we met with the pastor there. This was the church where we were married, and he basically just walked us through the concordance everywhere it talked about people being married, and we were convicted. I don't think that it was the best counseling, honestly, looking back, but maybe it was. He just gave us the straight truth, no interpretation, nothing else. And so he said, look, you have to decide, either you're going to follow God and you're going to get married, or you're going to separate for a while. This is what you should do, not telling us to do this. And I agreed in my heart. So I thought about it, and not long after that, I got down on my knees in our living room, and I asked Jane to marry me, and we wept, and she said yes, and we got married just like a month and a half later on a Wednesday in that local church. We got married there. We had about 65 people there. It was beautiful. It was like a church service. People are spending so much money on weddings, but we couldn't care less about that. We just wanted to be right with God. We wanted to do things the right way. And so we had 65, 70 people. We just had a little service. We sang a bunch of songs together. I mean, hearing 60, 70 people singing on your wedding day, I'll never forget it. How the walls shook. Praise for God. Worship of Him who brought us together, who gave us this gift of faith, I'm telling you. And then we were married, gave our vows, and we went downstairs and we had like a potluck. We had a bunch of people bring stuff, and then we donated, I think, $100 or $200 to the church, and that was it. And then I was working at the time, so we had to wait for our honeymoon a couple months later. We waited and we went to a state park. We stayed in a cabin. We were just hiking. It was nothing glamorous, but we were hiking, praying, singing. The love of my life, Jane. But fast forward, some years later, it's been about 13 years now. February 15th will be 13 years being a servant of Yeshua HaMashiach. And then now, we're in this situation where we were part of an independent fundamental Baptist, King James only church that we were part of for many years, which was a lot of homeschoolers there. Very traditional church, very conservative, very serious. A lot of truckers, a lot of gun people. Not anything bad about that. I'm just to give you a perspective. And later last year, we started just reading about the appointed times of God, Shavuot, Sukkot, and we started honoring the seventh-day Sabbath. And it was like as soon as we did, mountain of persecution came down on us. Like texts not being answered, phone calls not being returned, Facebook weirdness. We had people like stalking our Facebook pages, and they came down on us. They totally came after us. And, throughout all this persecution, through 3 families disowned us completely because, I basically said, we need to be talking about John chapter 7 during Feast of Tabernacles. We need to be talking about that or else something is wrong. And I was very respectful about it. Just trying to get interest in these things. For me as a former atheist, I look at it like, if I'm new and you are running things in the house of God, the building where you're worshiping, and you say you worship God with everything in you, but yet there's all these things about him that you just don't want to even hear about. It's terrifying to me. It's if you're in love with a woman and you say, I worship the ground you walk on, and she says, well, let me tell you about these different days that are important to me, and you're like, I don't have to even know about that. That's a completely separate thing. There was a woman who just really was hostile to my wife about just talking about Sukkot. She had invited her to sit in our sukkah and just sing and pray. So you can imagine. So here we are a few months later, Messianic believers. My children and my wife are Messianic Jews. I consider myself a Messianic Gentile, and that's fine. And here we are. We've been going to a Messianic congregation for about a month and a half now. It's a small congregation, but it's faithful people, very kind, not judgmental or harsh or shunning like the independent fundamental Baptist. And here we are. I started making this channel because these people were painting us to be like some kind of like divisive, like mean, angry people. And honestly, we didn't say anything bad about these people. We were just we were praising God and shining light on God and just saying, hey, we want to meet and talk about this outside of the church, I never, as a rule, never said anything when I was going there. I always walked up to the deacon after Sunday school when he gave his presentation, and I shook his hand and I said, good job. I made sure I did that because you want people to know you respect them. You want to honor others above yourselves, and right now we're struggling with, should we go to another Sunday church? We were outcasted from this church that we went to for many years because we're talking about Sukkot and the 7th-day Sabbath. Simple as that. I want to tell a whole story on another video, and it'll be shocking to you. But we wish them only well, and we love them. We're constantly reaching out, doors open. And now we're moving forward where we're networking, we're trying to meet with other believers who are sincerely searching for the truth and aren't threatened by like talk of the anti-Semitic history and the Roman Church. And that's really where my channel kind of blew wide open, because I just read a little bit. I had no idea all this stuff was swept under the rug. I started reading the complete Jewish Bible, and where it changes out law for Torah, which is how it should be, and it translates it the proper way, where different words are not meant one way or the other. It's a little vague, but I did a few videos on we're not under law but grace, things like that. So that's what I love. So last thing I'm going to tell you is that Yeshua the Messiah is the truth. He's the truth, the life, and the way. And the only way to the Father is through him. And I'll tell you, when I started to believe, just something changed. Probably most of the people that I knew from my past completely disowned me. I had a friend that I was friends with all through high school, where we were inseparable, where he just stopped responding to everything I sent to him, whether it was text message, Facebook message, anything. And he ended up writing me a several pages letter, just like, you believe in the sky daddy, and like this, he used crude words for circumcision and stuff like that. I had other friends who just stopped talking to me. I couldn't even reason with them. I couldn't even just say, hey, look, I can not talk about it. And it wasn't good enough. There was such a despising of God. And I think a lot of it was legitimate based on the actions of the church and the Roman Church and the American Church and people who are posing as Christians. So, when you look at this history, especially the Roman history, what they did to the Jewish people, it's shocking. I was looking at some of this history. I did a video about Chicago, about Christmas, December 25th, pagan observance. And I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had to read it. I had to step away every few pages because it was so violent and so vile what they did. So that's where I want to leave you, is just stay in the honest, sincere pursuit of truth. And it's there. And Yeshua is the truth. And I want to share with you one last thing that I often will have people ask me, oh, since you were an atheist, what would you recommend that I tell other atheists? And I'll tell you this. You tell them that you understand that it seems crazy to you. You understand that it seems totally crazy, because it is. It is crazy to someone who is living in this world, who's on the internet every day, who's taking in public school education, and who is influenced more by YouTube personalities and podcasters and like these entertainment people than they are by the Bible. Even people who call themselves Christians. Our old church was you wouldn't believe the harshness, the hostility that they pointed towards us. But I'll tell you right now, if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, indeed the Tanakh says, 1 verse 18. Actually, let's just go to 17. We're here. If you've been here this long, you have the patience of Messiah Yeshua. 17, for the Messiah did not send me to immerse, but to proclaim the good news, and to do it without relying on wisdom that consists of mere rhetoric, so as not to rob the Messiah's execution stake of its power. For the message is about the execution stake is nonsense to those in the process of being destroyed. But to us in the process of being saved, it is the power of God. Indeed, the Tanakh says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and frustrate the intelligence of the intelligent. Where does that leave the philosopher, the Torah teacher, or any of today's thinkers? This could be true today. Hasn't God made this world's wisdom look pretty foolish? When I was sitting in the lobby that day, I really believed that. For God's wisdom ordained that the world, using its own wisdom, would not come to know him. Therefore, God decided to use the nonsense of what we proclaim as his means of saving those who come to trust in it. Precisely because Jews ask for signs and Greeks try to find wisdom, we go on proclaiming a Messiah executed on a stake as a criminal. To Jews this is an obstacle, and to Greeks it is nonsense. But to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, the same Messiah is God's power and God's wisdom. For God's nonsense is wiser than humanity's wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than humanity's strength. Just look at yourselves, brothers. Look at those whom God has called. Not many of you are wise by the world's standards. Not many wield power or boast noble birth. But God chose what the world considers nonsense in order to shame the wise. God chose what the world considers weak in order to shame the strong. And God chose what the world looks down on as common and regards as nothing in order to bring to nothing what the world considers important, so that no one should boast before God. It is his doing that you are united with the Messiah Yeshua. I thank God for this, and I'm not turning back. Any of you that have subscribed, I thank God for you, and I wish you shalom in the fullest measure. I'll tell you right now, I've been following the Messiah Yeshua in truth, I think, for just about 6 months now. And the moment I said, in a conversation with my wife, I said, I was reading about what they did to the Jews. And I was reading about how Jewish, the fact that Yeshua is Jewish. He's actually Yeshua. And I said, I'm a Jew in my heart. And when I said that, something changed and the persecution began, really picked up steam. We've been Messianic believers for about 6 months now. And I'd say we've been in faith for about 13 years come February 15th. And here's a couple other things that you could praise God about. My wife's father was a doctor for decades. And he comes from a line of, I want to say 14 or 15 rabbis. He was not a rabbi. He was not religious at all. When we first came to faith, I hope she's not mad at me when I say this, but he was so offended that he didn't come to our wedding. And we kept praying for him. We kept praying for him. Like Yeshua said, keep asking the unjust judge. Well, God's not an unjust judge. Eventually he will listen and hear, answer your request, if it's his will. Over time, we prayed for him. We sent him books. Some he threw away. Some he gave away. And then finally we sent him a book by Nabil Qureshi, called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, one of my favorite books, about a Muslim who came to believe in Yeshua. That book and a couple others. Reason for God by Tim Keller is one. And he's an interesting guy, but we gave him these different books, and one day, it was on around Passover. We did call it Easter then. This was a few years ago. He called us, and he sounded different. He sounded gentle. And he said, Stephen, Jane, just like Nabil came to believe, I now believe. Praise God. My father-in-law, Paul, we talked for about, 20 minutes, something like that. And then we looked, and he had also sent us an email, which we saw. And he was following Yeshua. And then over time, he did get involved with Jehovah's Witnesses. And we prayed for him about that. And I remember one conversation, it was tense. We had him on speakerphone. And my wife was like talking to him, and he's like, yeah, I'm eventually, I think you guys will come to believe this way. And I said, we won't. And I'm not worried about it at all that you're involved with them, because I know that I'm praying that God is going to use you to influence them. And look, guess what happened? Several months later, actually over a year later, we sent him a book by Asher Introtter called Who Ate Lunch with Abraham. Now, it talks about this Trinity, but it doesn't call it that, and it really isn't exactly that, but it just says that God can take human form. God has taken human form. Who ate lunch with Abraham? One of them was Yeshua. Some of these other times, they call him Christophanies, or if you want to get into that, but that book totally changed his perspective. And so now he's shining the lights of Jehovah's Witnesses. He returned everything. He's going around, and he's actually a couple people he's brought over to Messianic services. So praise God, look at that. A lot of different people. So I'm going to leave you with that he has come to faith. We have been delivered from persecution into a warm, loving, faithful Messianic congregation. And God is just not leaving us alone. He just won't. Even in little days where I try to turn away, or something rebellious in my flesh rises up, I trust in him. Yeshua, who delivered me and who delivered you. So that's it for me. That's enough out of me. I've talked forever. I wanted to do it this way. And if you notice, I don't put a lot of effort into the presentation. I don't edit anything. I'm not trying to impress anybody. I'm not a prophet or any kind of title or great teacher or anything. I'm just a father. And I'm just a believer in Yeshua. I'm one of his servants. And he is my king. So I serve Adonai Sevaot. And I'd like to invite you to New Yerushalayim at the end. Come to faith, believe with me in him who died the criminal's death. Miracle, miraculous birth, virgin birth, and who was risen again on the third day, defeated law of sin and death, which we are no longer under the law of sin and death anymore. Our body might die in this world, but our spirit will never die, and we will, if we stay true, be with him forever. I think a lot of American Christians want to go to heaven. They just don't want God to be there when they get there. They see it as a carnal place where they could just relax and do whatever they want. But when I read, I can see that it's just praising God. There's no more sadness, no more anxiety. My mother, last thing too, a few weeks before my mother died, I talked to her on the phone, and I was so on fire for the Lord, for Adonai. She was shocked. She was depressed. And I was talking to her and telling her about God, and we prayed together, and she wept, cried like I never heard her cry before. And she asked God for forgiveness. She asked me for forgiveness. And I said, I have total grace. I love you. I don't have anything against you. And she wept. And then a couple weeks later, she passed away in her sleep. She passed away in her sleep in her bed. So I know that when I go to be with Yeshua, that these people will be there. My mother will be there. She's passed on. It'll be 11 years now, in just about a week. This time is always very hard. So I wanted to bare my soul a little bit. Thanks all for joining me, listening to my testimony for Yeshua. And I pray the blessed shalom in the fullest measure on you. That's enough out of me. Thank you so much. Many blessings and shalom on you and your house. Please, whatever you do, Shaul, Paul said everything that was important to him, everything even about him being Jewish, he counted as a disadvantage, as garbage, just to the supreme knowledge of having Yeshua as your Messiah, of knowing who he is, and loving him and being united with him. So my prayer for you is to be united with the Messiah, Yeshua, and worship him in truth and in spirit. Engage in the honest, sincere pursuit of truth, and test every spirit with this. Love your brothers with everything you have in you, and your sisters. Be kind, honor others above yourselves. When people curse you, pray for them. When people attack you, pray for them and bless them. This is our Messiah, who died for us, who when people mocked him at the foot of the cross, he said, Father, forgive them. This is who we should imitate in everything that we do. So, many blessings and shalom. Thank you for listening this far. If you're part of this channel, then I love you as a brother and sister. And I thank you for encouraging me too, because some of the comments there were some of the comments from the audio Bibles that it affected you that I literally cried. Thank you so much. And anything I do, I'm doing it for Yeshua. And I can't wait to see him, and I can't wait to meet you this side of heaven or in New Yerushalayim. New Yerushalayim, let's get there together. That's enough out of me. Many blessings and shalom.